Okay, so we're going to start to look at imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century, chapter 26 in McKay. First, we need to understand that there sort of was, well, before we even get to the different types of imperialism, a very bare bones definition. Really super simple. It's just when one country controls another, or one country controls a certain area of the world. It can take different forms. It can be political, economic, or cultural in nature. And we'll see how um, old forms of imperialism were mainly more economic in nature. Um, but you can certainly see all three of these kind of playing in with the new imperialism. Um, there was a period of imperialism prior, though, to this era, really starting with the age of exploration in the 16th century. So that you could consider the old imperialism, right? When we talk about, the explorers, Vasco da Gama, Columbus, and so on. Um, but there's a major difference between the two. The old imperialism, which again really started in the 16th century with the age of explorers, and then really concludes around the 18th century. The major differences. Well, first off, the European powers really weren't interested in gaining territory. Instead, they were more interested in just building up trading stations, just finding ways to access different goods from different parts of the world. So, some examples here that are in your notes, they're not right here on the slide, but Portugal is a really good example. They established a bunch of trading posts along the west coast of Africa, India, and Indonesia. So remember when Portugal was working to find a trade route to India, it stopped often along the coast of Africa and established these trading posts, but it didn't actually occupy or rule territory in Africa. And they did this to expand their spice trade, and also the Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish an African slave trade in the New World when they colonized Brazil. The Netherlands, it also establishes trading posts mostly in Indonesia and Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka. Europeans also oftentimes are establishing trading areas in Asia, India, China, Japan, Indonesia. However, unlike the new imperialism, during the period of old imperialism, Europeans tended to respect the local rulers. So they weren't doing anything to try to usurp whatever kind of political authority existed in those countries. All right, so old imperialism is much less invasive. There's one major exception to this, however, and that is with the New World. Okay, so if we're thinking about the Americas, so think about Spain first. Spain establishes a huge empire in Central and South America, and it also lays claim to a bunch of portions of land in Western North America, so, California, Texas, Utah, New Mexico, and so on. Spain is not only trading in these areas, but it is living in them, it is ruling over them, it is conquering the previous people that lived there. So that shows us that in the New World, it's not really old imperialism. It's already resembling new imperialism with the example of Spain. You also see that they enslave or subjugate the native people that they come across. And because of the Columbian exchange, many of them just die off due to disease. Portugal could be another example. I mentioned earlier that Portugal has a major colony in Brazil, right? So again, they're establishing it as this time a sugar colony. They are importing tons of slaves from Africa, and they're also living there. So they are replacing the government, the culture, the society that existed there prior to their arrival. So that's not old imperialism in that sense. England also plays into this New World definition. When it colonizes the east coast of North America, we know that that's temporary because of the American Revolution, but still a good example of old, how the old imperialism in the New World is more like new imperialism. They also colonized parts of Canada. And speaking of Canada, the French also established a colony in Canada, and they also had some sugar colonies in the Caribbean. So that's just a kind of bare bones idea of how there is this older form of imperialism, but in the New World they were already experimenting with forms of imperialism that resemble what we have here in the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay, so there are many economic changes that are starting to contribute towards imperialism. Later, we're going to talk about how also you have social factors as well, especially patterns of migration. But first, let's think about how the economic development in the West is contributing towards imperialism. So we've already talked a lot about how these Western European countries have been industrializing rapidly. And so what this is doing is this is making people's salaries go up significantly, okay? So when people's income rates start to soar, they are also greatly surpassing the types of income that people who live in third world or developing countries are earning. All right, so because of this, you're going to see um, oftentimes people who live in Western societies who are making more money often are going to be moving away from agricultural societies. Um, this shows that their standard of living is far surpassing those of non-Western regions. So eventually what you're going to see is because a lot of people, due to industrialization, are moving to more urban areas, they need to have some sort of agricultural production to supplement what they are losing because so many people are moving away from agricultural areas in Europe. So they exploit these third world populations that are still largely rural and agricultural in nature and import those raw agricultural materials from them. Um, you're also going to see that because, again, of the rise of living standards, in Europe, goods become much more affordable, so you're going to see international trade expand rapidly. And again, the desire is to be trading with far away places, especially, the idea is when things are more affordable, you are also going after maybe the more luxurious types of products, types of goods. England is a leader in this sense because it has the most substantial colonial empire at first. England has colonies in India, Canada, Australia, and regions in the Caribbean at first. So what this means is that Britain is able to take advantage of all the natural resources that exist in these places. And this means that the manufacturing that takes place in England can be cheaper because they can get raw materials for such a cheap price. A really good example of this is that they're able to get really cheap cotton from India, and this allows them to take that raw cotton and manufacture it, turn it into finished clothed goods, and do that at a cheaper price because they can get cotton for so cheap from India, right? You're also going to see that again, because of the agricultural production in these third world countries, you're going to see the increase of plantations and mines in these areas. Again, so they can get lots of raw materials. They can also sell goods more cheaply, which means that countries like England are going to be able to export much more. You're also going to see that there are a lot of tariffs all over Europe, right, trying to protect their own individual economies. So because of that, you're going to see Britain in particular export more things to non-Western countries because they don't have tariffs, right? So basically what this means is that in India, they were actually trying to have a manufacturing industry because they do have the raw material, they have the cotton, but because England is shipping manufactured textile goods at such a cheap price to India, their textile manufacturing industry is never able to take off. So because these third world countries do not have tariffs, it allows countries like England to export to them very heavily. Um, so you're also going to see a significant improvement in transportation, which is going to facilitate trade. All right, you're going to see the growth of railroads all over the developing world, in addition to the already developed world. Okay, for example, England puts a ton of railroads up in India, and we're going to talk about the English colonization of India much more in the future. So this makes it so that transportation costs are much cheaper, and it makes trade networks much more significantly expanded. You're going to see also with industrialization the advent of the refrigerated railroad car, which means that you can ship perishable goods like meat for the first time. All right, so this is actually going to make the cattle industry grow significantly, and that has particular benefits in North America and Argentina because they're significant cattle exporters. All right, another huge improvement in transportation was the development of canals. Uh, the two most significant ones are the Suez and Panama canals, which significantly shorten trade routes and it makes trade much cheaper. You're also going to see improvements in communication. All right, this is when the transoceanic telegraph route is laid down. So this means you actually have telegraph wires that go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And what this means is with this greater communication, you can set prices really easily and instantaneously. And you can also add destinations to existing trade routes, things that have already embarked. So, say you have a ship that's on its way to the Caribbean and suddenly Brazil also wants to buy certain products that the ship is bringing over from Europe, it can communicate via telegraph and be able to add something onto that route, make it much easier. So you're also just going to see European countries investing all over the place to develop other countries that they might start to settle. So you're going to see that Europeans are investing in places like North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually, because they're developing transportation networks, for example, in these places, it makes it much easier to settle them. Okay, so the first area of significant imperialism that we're going to talk about is China. All right, so before imperialism starts in China, China is one of the most isolated countries from the West. They tended to have absolutely no interest in trading with Western countries at all. And when foreign merchants did come into China, they had to respect all of China's rules, their existing system of trade. So, basically, China was running the show as far as trade was concerned. If you were a foreign trader, you were restricted as to where you could live, where you could trade. You could only buy from local merchants. So traders, for example, could only live in the area called Canton, which is where the language Cantonese comes from. So yeah, at first foreign trade with China is really limited until the opium trade begins. All right, so again, this signals a major change because prior to the opium trade, there was absolutely nothing that the West could offer that China wanted to buy. So every time a country like England was in China, they would have to pay hard cash for whatever Chinese product they wanted to buy. Then England starts bringing opium in from India, which was where they were growing it, and the Chinese start to become very interested in purchasing opium, and and eventually you're going to see that by the 1830s, 56% of Chinese imports are opium, which is really significant. But the Chinese government does not like this because, of course, opium is a drug. It's very harmful. It's actually, significantly affecting families and just the overall welfare of society. So very quickly, the Chinese government is trying to restrict the importation of opium into its country, which leads to two opium wars. Okay, so the first opium war. What happens is the government of China, which was the Qing dynasty at this time, Qing dynasty, starts to confiscate all this opium that was being imported into China. It starts to blockade foreign opium trade, and it's also making merchants stay in specific quarters and not go in, not kind of broaden their scope as to who they can sell opium to. This is going to make a lot of people who want to purchase opium and a lot of foreign traders really upset. And so, so the people who reject the trade restrictions, they're actually kicked out of Canton, and Britain decides to respond to this militarily. All right, so the Opium War is between Britain and China. Right, so the British are going to actually use troops that they have from India to start occupying a bunch of different Chinese coastal cities. All right, this occupation is going to make China surrender, and the result of the first Opium War is something called the Treaty of Nanking. And the result of that is that it gives Hong Kong to Britain. Technically, the treaty said forever. It actually holds on to Hong Kong until 1997. And it also opens up four large Chinese cities to foreign trade with really low tariffs.